Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Overseas Development Institute for this event on UK investment in Africa. And we're very happy to have this meeting today so we can sort of follow up on yesterday's meeting, which was a really positive meeting around Africa's opportunities to invest. And we're very fortunate to have an excellent panel. But before I introduce the chair, I just want to say two practical issues. So if anybody would like to go to the lavatory, then it's the end of the corridor on the left. If there's a fire alarm, please go outside, and the collection point is just outside on the left. We're very fortunate to have Lord Paul Boateng chairing this event. Apart from being a great friend from ODI, he's got great experience in African trade and investment matters. He is the co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Commission on Group on Trading Out of Poverty. He's also a former High Commissioner to South Africa. And he knows a lot about trade and investment in Africa. So without further ado, over to you, Lord Boateng, to chair this event.
Thank you very much indeed, Dirk. My name is Paul Boateng. What we're here to do is to engage with this topic of Africa, investment, its development, the prosperity of Africa and the wider world, and how we make a difference, frankly. We make a difference at a critical time in the history, not just of this country, but at a critical time in the history of the development of the continent, as we look to the growth of a meaningful free trade area, as we look to addressing the demographic challenges and opportunities that exist on the continent. And we meet in the immediate aftermath of a summit that really offers a space which we have to fill if we are to deliver on the expectations and hopes that it has generated. To do that, we are blessed this afternoon with a really powerful panel. But the reality of these events, as you all know, is that if they are to make a difference, then they have to go beyond the panel to include everyone in this room. Your experience, your vision, your hopes and expectations, and what it is that you and the organizations of which you are part bring to the table. We're all activists here. We're activists for investment, we're activists for development. And so the structure of this afternoon is going to be one that maximizes the opportunities for inputs from everyone. Dirk has given me my very clear instruction that we've all got to be out of here by 3:30 with the job done. To deliver on that, and I see a certain amount of skepticism on the part of some in that regard, but it's going to happen. We're going to be out of here by 3:30. And so I don't just bring the experience that Dirk has outlined in terms of being a former High Commissioner, former Chief Secretary of the Treasury. I bring also this, which is a stopwatch. And it will be used, I can assure you. So I say that to the panel. I also say it to you all. You'll hear it ticking away. But without further ado, I'm going to ask Stephen Karingi, to deliver a very special message in terms of keynote remarks from Vera Songwe, who you know is Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission on Africa. And Stephen brings his experience as Director of Regional Trade and Integration for that organization. Vera has been called out to a meeting with President Kagame, so you'll understand why she's not with us. But we're really glad to have you, Stephen. So over to you. Let's give him a round of applause, shall we?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Chair. So this message is on behalf of Vera, as the Chair has said, our Executive Secretary. So I'm delighted to be here today among esteemed researchers, partner organizations, friends, and colleagues. Let me start by thanking the ODI for inviting ECA to partner in organizing this timely dialogue on increasing UK investment in Africa. The changing trade and investment contexts in the UK and Africa that are underpinned by Brexit and the African Continental Free Trade Area offer an unprecedented opportunity to introduce a more comprehensive Africa-UK trade and investment framework. ECA's valued partnership with the ODI dates back to 2016, when we initiated a joint research program to produce evidence-based, relevant, and practicable recommendations for policymakers focused on the Africa-UK trade and investment relationships. Since this date, we have published a series of reports and papers and organized a number of events that have raised the profile of Africa within the British trade policy agenda and encouraged constructive and progressive thinking on how to advance Africa-UK trade. In celebrating this partnership, let me sincerely thank the UK Department for International Trade for their generous financial support. The focus of this keynote statement is a topic of utmost importance to Africa's structural transformation and development agenda, that is FDI. FDI brings with it capital, jobs, and links to the global economy. But Africa's experience is of other investment. Despite being home to 17% of the world's population, Africa accounts for just 2.8% of the world investment stock. According to our sister organization, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, in 2017, the UK represented the fourth largest investor in Africa. The UK invested $60 billion in Africa, up from $46 billion in 2013, and this is only $4 billion behind France, which is the world's leading investor in Africa. Frankly, investment in Africa is not always an easy task, particularly for investors who are less familiar with our unique terrain. Political risk, corruption, inadequate transport and energy infrastructure, skills shortages, and policy uncertainty are among the leading cited challenges for UK investors in Africa. Yet, we are making progress on all these fronts. 4 of the top 10 improvers globally in the 2018 Doing Business rankings were African and have a good reason to be optimistic about the future. Africa's GDP, as you have heard over the last 2 days, is forecast to grow rapidly from an estimated $2.5 trillion to as much as $16 trillion by 2060. And this is according to the ADB, the African Development Bank forecasts. 6 of the top 10 fastest growing economies are estimated by the IMF to have been in Africa in 2019. In about 6 months from now, trading will start under the African Continental Free Trade Area. This defines not only a new blueprint for Africa's trade, but also the continent's entire long-term development agenda. 54 of the 55 African Union member states have now signed the AfCFTA, and 30 of them have ratified. Eritrea is the only country not to have signed and ratified the agreement yet. With this strong momentum behind the AfCFTA, we will soon have an integrated African market of 1.2 billion people and with a GDP of 2.5 trillion. But why is the African Continental Free Trade Area a game changer for investment in Africa? Because we're talking about investments. First, the AfCFTA modalities commit the African Union member states to remove tariffs on at least 97% of goods imported from other state parties over a period of between 5 and 15 years. This ambitious trade liberalization is expected to support the development of African regional value chains and create opportunities for further integration into global value chains. Second, beyond tariff liberalization, the AfCFTA is also targeted at addressing key challenges to improving Africa's trade and investment environment, including the non-tariff barriers, standards harmonization, customs cooperation, and trade facilitation. These complementary measures will be crucial to boosting industry and enterprise-level competitiveness and reducing business costs. They will also provide a framework for eliminating some of the market access barriers that are currently challenging British firms. Third, the scope of the CFTA is beyond a traditional free trade agreement, covering not only trade in goods, but also trade in services, investment, intellectual property rights, and competition policy. The AFCFTA investment protocol, for instance, will provide common rules for state parties to introduce harmonized incentives for attracting incentives to accelerate development. This regulatory convergence on investment issues is expected to facilitate access by both African and foreign investors in a broader African market. This offers an opportunity for the UK and other development partners to diversify their trade and investment in Africa, since it will make it easier to engage in African countries in designing transboundary investment projects. However, the main preferences and benefits under the CFTA are accorded to businesses that ensure that their production involves sufficiency transformation or value addition in African countries. The level of value addition or transformation varies by product as determined by the AFCFTA rules of origin. The AFCFTA is not about unfettered openness, but an invitation to substantially invest and produce value in Africa. South Africa and other relatively more advanced countries such as Egypt are already positioning themselves to take advantage of the AFCFTA by offering a gateway to the continent and an attractive destination for investors to establish regional headquarters. Smaller economies such as Uganda and Togo are also strategizing on how to use the AFCFTA as a platform for integrating into African markets and attracting investments into targeted sectors of comparative advantage. Beyond the AFCFTA, why must United Kingdom investors look more seriously at the African continent? The African market is a highly dynamic one. The population, as you know, is projected to reach 2.5 billion by 2050, at which point it will comprise 26% of what is projected to be world's working age population, with an economy that is estimated to grow twice as rapidly as that of the developed world. This will enable large economies of scale and create rewarding trade and investment opportunities. Further, the rising African middle class will increase demand for higher quality goods and services. Of specific relevance to British investment, ECA recently published or partnered with the ODI to prepare a study on new opportunities for bilateral UK-Africa trade and investment. The findings of the final paper, which will be presented later in this event, the findings of the final paper will actually be presented later in this afternoon. However, I want to underscore that we identified a remarkable range of investment opportunities in sectors where the UK has a strong comparative advantage. In particular, and I think this message came out yesterday in the summit, there exists significant opportunity for British investors in agro-processing, business and professional services, technology-based solutions in the financial and insurance sector, fast-moving consumption goods and services, education, and renewable energies. Now, to materialize these opportunities, African countries need to address barriers associated with the challenging business climate and infrastructure gaps and work towards improving skills so UK firms operating in Africa do not have to worry about importing talent from abroad. The African Union's Agenda 2063, the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, and also Accelerating Industrialization in African Action Plan provide a set of frameworks to support this process. The UK government and private sector can also play an important role in facilitating African countries to alleviate some of these market access barriers. And in fact, the Department of International Trade is already investing resources towards this goal, which we are thankful for. The growing number of special economic zones also offer additional magnets for investment into the continent. There are an estimated 237 special economic zones in Africa, along with more than 200 single enterprise zones. Special economic zones operate in 38 of the 54 economies on the continent, with the highest number being in Kenya. Stronger regional cooperation also creates scope for more ambitious regional and cross-border zones. For example, in 2018, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, and Mali launched a special economic zone spanning border regions of the three countries. Similarly, Ethiopia and Kenya recently announced the intention to convert the Moyale region into a cross-border free trade zone. So how can the UK-Africa investment relationship be improved upon to support Africa's development agenda? The UK government aims for the UK to be the top G7 investor in the continent by 2022. This goal is in close sight and only requires a boost of just over $4 billion investment per year. Yet, to make the envisaged boost of British investment in Africa worthwhile, a key challenge will be to diversify UK foreign direct investment, which is currently heavily focused on extractives and financial services sector, and also mainly in South Africa. At the same time, the UK's investment relationship with Africa needs to be complemented with a more comprehensive and development-friendly trade policy, which improves upon the existing EU economic partnership agreements. Brexit offers an opportunity to move beyond a focus on preferences to more effectively address issues related to standards, rules of origin, services liberalization, technical assistance and capacity building, industrial provisions, and policy space. A development-focused Africa-UK trade partnership would build upon the UK's already successful and effective Aid for Trade program. As part of this, the UK government should consider stepping up support for African continental integration as underpinned by the AFCFTA by helping to connect countries through fiscal, regulatory, and digital measures. The agreement offers a tool for achieving development partner priorities such as structural transformation, job creation, gender equality, and poverty reduction. It is expected also to generate new commercial opportunities in agriculture, industry, and digital economy. In this regard, the Department for International Development efforts to support trade facilitation in Africa and recent decision to provide support to the African Union on the second phase of the African Continental Free Trade Area negotiations, which includes investment, are greatly appreciated. A fully development-oriented trade and investment policy between the UK and Africa would not just be in Africa's interest. Indeed, a unified, more visible and robust African market would also provide great opportunities for British investors and businesses. At the same time, a progressive approach to trade with the continent would allow the United Kingdom's new trade policy to support the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals in Africa through supporting job creation and income generation. As I conclude, the main message which I wish to emphasize is that the AFCFTA offers a potential game changer for the United Kingdom investment in Africa and an opportunity to diversify and enhance the return of UK investments. I say potential because tapping into this opportunity will require deliberate actions by both the British government, investors, and our leaders in Africa. With this in mind, the Economic Commission for Africa has joined forces with the African Union Commission to assist African countries to prepare the African Continental Free Trade Area national implementation strategies that are designed to identify new opportunities for diversification and investment, and also the complementary actions that are needed to overcome existing constraints to trade and reduce market access barriers. Although the AFCFTA is a continental agreement, implementation will take place at the national level, and the agreement must be translated and contextualized in domestic realities. And as you know, the UK yesterday hosted the UK-Africa Investment Summit. The UK is also Commonwealth Chair until the 2020 Commonwealth Heads of Government that is going to meet in Rwanda. Both have provided ideal platforms to strengthen UK-Africa trade and investment linkages and also facilitate private long-term investment into African countries. So in the midst of political reprioritizations of a Brexit, I hope that the British government will not lose sight of the need to maintain and improve the UK's already strong and valued relationship with Africa. The UK's goal of becoming the largest G7 investor in Africa is a good one, but it is not ambitious enough. A boost of only $4 billion to UK investment in Africa will be required for UK to surpass the United States and France in terms of the value of investment into the continent. Africa and the United Kingdom must work together to go beyond this, to double or even triple the current levels of UK investment in Africa. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that, Stephen. You can convey our thanks to Vera. One of the great advantages of gatherings such as this is it's not just us in this room. So we want to welcome participants, fellow activists from the World Wide Web who are, as we speak, participating in this event, because as you were speaking, Stephen, I was getting remarks from our web-based participants, and they'll have an opportunity, and they were moderately favourable, you'll be glad to hear, but also had some challenges too for the governments of Africa as well as our own government. So they'll be participating in the wider discussion that we'll be having later on. But before we do that, I thought it was, and before we hear from our distinguished panel, I think it would be helpful to have a response from the private sector, a contribution from the private sector, and we're very lucky to have with us Dominic McVeigh, the former chairman of Hela Clothing, who's actually doing the business of manufacture in Ethiopia, in Kenya, and in Ghana, and who's been a participant in yesterday's summit. Because at the end of the day, you know, we can have all the plans, all the wishes, all the commissions in the world, but it's about people bringing money, resource, skill, talent, expertise, a willingness to take risks to the market that will enable Africa to grow, and the relationship between Africa and Britain to deliver the prosperity agenda that we seek for all our people. So over to you, Dominic. We look forward. We understand you've got a plane to catch, so you're going to be brief, but we think your contribution is an important one.
My pleasure, and thank you, Chair. And it's a pleasure to be back here at the ODI, where I've contributed to the research and also spent many a day, many an hour reading the research that the ODI has produced. So to get my view is very much an honour, and I hope useful and beneficial to you all. First of all, I think the fact that the Africa Investment Summit happened was a huge achievement and a huge step forwards for Britain and Britain's relationships with countries in Africa and on the continent. I've spent the last several years as a proponent, a promoter of doing business in Africa. I actually lived in southern Uganda on the Rwanda and Congolese borders when I was 20, working with young entrepreneurs, trying to help them get better returns for their potatoes and to sell them not at harvest, but be able to hold on to them for 6 months. And the transformation that I saw within such a short amount of time for those communities was beyond what I could imagine. And the potential and the opportunity, the talent, the skill, and the belief in Africa is there. Unfortunately, the investment hasn't been there, and the investment hasn't come as quickly or as actively as one would hope. So with that in mind, and the AIS being present at the forefront of the British government's agenda, and it's I think since the election of the Conservative government to majority, to see their first investment summit focus on Africa, I think sends a very, very strong message. But what else can be done, and what must we do, and what have we seen happening at AIS beyond what may have already been in play or already planned? We've seen huge investments announced by Diageo. We've seen a number of commitments to several regions by major companies. But would they have happened with or without AIS? That's yet to be understood. But have we opened up the doors and created people's eyes and visions to focus on Africa more seriously? I think AIS has certainly achieved that. But we mustn't forget there is still a lot of work to be done and a lot of development to be done by agencies such as DFID and its counterparts in other countries and regions. I couldn't trade in Kenya. I couldn't get my ships and my product to countries and customers if it wasn't for the investments that have been laid down by organisations such as DFID and their partners such as Trademark East Africa, who you're going to hear from more. But quite frankly, I couldn't get my goods out of the country or the raw materials in if it wasn't for those infrastructure projects. And there is more still to be done. Cost per mile of shipping goods out of Ethiopia is one of the highest globally. I think almost 8% of FOB on shipments outside of Ethiopia, 8% is on logistics, whereas China is, I think, less than 1%. I think it drops down to 0.2%. So as we invest in industries such as the garment sector, productivity is always key. Now, what is the driving force for me to invest in Ethiopia and Kenya and Ghana? And what are the driving forces that make the change? Well, ultimately, AGOA was our investment. All my shipments, all my exports, I manufacture garments. We do over $50 million in exports. And Hella has almost 6,000 employees in East Africa. All the goods are shipped to America. But we're competing with Bangladesh. We're competing with Vietnam. And we are, despite the trade war, these countries are competing with China. The reason they're still competing is because the efficiencies and the productivity and cost to trade is far, far less than what we see in the likes of Ethiopia. Because of that, some people, a lot of people, are still buying their underwear out of Chinese factories and paying very high import duties. So the benefit factor for Ethiopia is AGOA. But if we don't get the cost per mile down, if we don't get the investment in infrastructure, and ultimately if we don't get the productivity up, it will be challenging for these economies to still remain competitive. So we then look towards the domestic market and what we're able to do. AGOA is potentially expiring in 2025. If we don't get the efficiency levels of production in manufacturing to those of what we see in Bangladesh and China, we all know and we all have our concerns about fast fashion in these industries. They move on to somewhere else, somewhere that's potentially cheaper to source from, somewhere that's certainly more productive. So we have to make sure that we can invest in the supply chains, that we can show attraction to investment into the communities, and also make sure that these countries have the infrastructure, the deliverables, and actually the people, the skills are created to allow these countries to be productive and stand on their own 2 feet. So what can we see that needs to be done as a manufacturer in this space? Unfortunately, for every $100 million of exports a garment manufacturer may do out of Kenya, 70 million of that will go straight to somewhere like China or India. Raw materials are not available. It gets even sadder in the conversation when you understand that cotton is probably grown in sub-Saharan Africa. It gets even sadder when you hear that cotton is grown in sub-Saharan Africa, shipped to India to be ginned, sent to China to be milled and spun and dyed, and then sent all the way back to Kenya to be manufactured and cut. So let's think of the impact that this is having not just on environment, but economies, and also the loss of income. And I'm not an economist, but I often see reports of GDP growth and hitting almost double digits in some of these economies. But I know that growth is also reported on the exports that manufacturers are making. So, for example, a manufacturer exports $100 million worth of goods. We already know that 70 million of those dollars never actually turned up in the country and probably went straight to the raw material supplier. So I'm a huge proponent of making sure that raw materials and the value add in the supply chain is domesticated. It's closer to supply. You have to think of garments in particular as a perishable. Clothing goes out of fashion just as quick as bananas go off, maybe even faster, unfortunately. So speed, efficiencies are all key to developing these economies. And as we take pace, and we want a domestic production, we want revenues to be generated domestically, we have to go invest backwards. We can't just be looking to create jobs. We've created thousands of jobs. The garment industry, for every $10 million you export, you might create 1,000 sustainable jobs. But to make those jobs worthwhile, to make sure there's prosperity, to make sure GDP is actually being booked in countries, to make sure there are tax revenues, we have to get more of the supply chain in action. And this doesn't just go for the garment sector. This goes across the board. You may have countries which are assembling vehicles, but ultimately it's probably still from a third-party country. It's like putting Lego together. Where is the value in that for Africa? A lot of these raw materials are probably mined in Africa, shipped to other countries to be produced and brought back. There is no value there for Africa. We have to create the value in country. And people often say to me, as an investor, why are you telling everyone this? It might put your cost of goods up, but ultimately I've invested in Africa because I love Africa. I believe there's huge change to be had. It is the most exciting continent. I think we can all agree with that. It has the biggest potential, and AIS will hopefully allow us to fulfill that, but we must grasp bigger issues and understanding that infrastructure is still key, cost per mile is still key, and making sure we have our supply chains domestically. Now, I will continue to wave the flag and encourage you to invest in Africa despite the challenges, but this is a week of opportunity and excitement and to promote what is possible. Just to wrap up, we set up Hela in Kenya just over 3 years ago. We're almost hitting $50 million a year in exports. I couldn't do that in the UK. I couldn't set up an underwear factory here in London, try and employ 6,000 people and do $50 million of exports. It wouldn't be possible. It was possible in Kenya. It's been possible in Ethiopia. And these are skills which we were told were not available. Anything is possible, and the challenge is really overcome. You don't go to Africa believing it's easy, but you go to Africa because it's rewarding and it can deliver. So I'd like to wrap up on that, Chair, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity. I hope I've touched on some points which help you further to discuss the panel.
Thank you very much. I think you'll agree that was well worth hearing. And the question always, where is the value for Africa? Where's the value for Africa? Thank you, Dominic, for that. We now have a really important contribution. And I just want to say a big thank you to you, Max, and to your team here at the ODI for all the work that has gone into this, because we believe in evidence-based policy. Here is the evidence, and we look forward very much to hearing you present it.
Thank you very much, Chair, and also extend the congratulations to the team, to Lily Summer from ATPC and to Sherilyn Raga, that they were involved. We started with this research basically starting from the idea that there are challenges that both Africa and the UK face. So basically we took at this as the issue of investment, not just from a development perspective, but also trying to think of what would motivate investors to come into Africa. Clearly, when we see of the challenges in Africa, we can say we know that. I mean, 1 out of 2 people that are going to be born between 2020 and 2050 are going to be Africans. And that means not in the future now, that will generate jobs for all these people that are going to come. And that means that, specifically in the case of Africa, means the transformation of its economy, moving into a higher value, higher productivity, production structure that involve competitive agriculture, manufacturing, and services. That will require capital, of course. That will require staff, will require hardware, but also will require expertise, require the capability of knowing how to do those things. They can be developed locally, and they are in many cases. But of course, I mean, the needs are in many cases now. And foreign investment is a way of actually acquiring those capabilities. What are the challenges that the UK face? I mean, as I said, I mean, we look this at also the sort of the UK side. What are the challenges? Well, it's never the EU was actually an obstacle to invest in Africa or to increase the engagement with the continent. Clearly, Brexit brought the opportunity of thinking about many of these things. So this is probably a positive thing about the whole process, is the capability of thinking. We thought about preferences and things that can be done to increase trade. So clearly, that is one opportunity there. But of course, I mean, in the context of low economic growth and low returns, Africa brings a fantastic opportunity to invest. I mean, clearly, a return of investment in Africa is around a 6.5% average, much higher than one in Latin America, and also much higher than those in developed countries. So clearly, there are an opportunity for the UK to clearly, for firms, for investors to make a return. So clearly, and the UK is already engaged in the continent. This is the 4th largest investor. However, what we saw is that half of that investment, half of that stock is on the extractive sector. Half of that, roughly half stock, is basically located in South Africa and in Nigeria. So there are an opportunity, as I said, to looking into other sectors, but also into other countries. So clearly, the need of Africa of diversifies economy, transforms the economy, and the UK of looking for to invest is what brings this mutual benefit win-win agenda. So clearly, the trick is actually trying to meet the two challenges together. And this clearly has issues. I mean, it's not easy, although seems to be like going from here to there. I mean, clearly there are a lot of challenges, there are a lot of constraints there. So basically what we did is we went to Africa, and here in London, we asked British investors to tell us what are the opportunities, where do they see that is the business going to be in Africa, the opportunities, and also to see what are the issues. I mean, what are the issues that they face when they are doing businesses in the continent. There are clearly cross-continent issues that we are aware of. I mean, Africa is a challenging environment. We are not going to deny that. Clearly, the infrastructure is an issue that was brought. I mean, but it's not just the stuff, basically, the infrastructure. I mean, it's also how the infrastructure, the existing infrastructure, is managed. So, for example, in the case of Kenya, we heard loads of complaints about the operation of the SGR, the standard gauge railway. I mean, that basically is a serious issue because it makes, in many cases, cost more expensive actually than that was expected. Also, on the energy, although the availability of electricity in Kenya is good, costs are very high, and this is precisely because the structure of the market in Kenya. But also here, other things quite familiar relation to the business environment, doing the day-to-day business in Africa. I mean, thinking in terms of regulations that are introduced without being consulted, sometimes are hard to implement because they could have been first consulted, those that are affected, are hard to implement because they weren't consulted. Many times there are ad hoc regulations. Also, what we saw in all the countries is a sort of an idea that they think that they are targeted in a sense because they are big and foreigner, and that means that they have the eye all the time in compliance with regulations, and that is not the same with the rest of the local companies, and that presents an issue for them. And of course, what they see is that particularly trading within the continent is complicated, is costly. So what are the opportunities, what we see? What we hear is a recognition in all countries about the talent, what we call the African talent. Many investors will recognize that as a sort of advantage. I mean, that entrepreneurship that many, particularly the young Africans have. And that is revealed in many of the opportunities there. Agribusiness is an area for development. The UK is a high quality brand in Africa. I mean, it's recognized the good quality of consumer goods, consumer services, but also on of different capital goods. And there are opportunities based definitely in terms of the growing population and income, as it was said, on fast-moving consumer goods. Manufacturing clearly is an area where the Africa is very interested on attracting investment. Clearly what we saw is that in the UK there is a lot of expertise and capabilities to provide many of the services that modern manufacturing need. We are talking about insurance, that is a sector that is not widely developed in the country, in the continent, but also business services, professional services, etc., that are needed in the development of manufacturing. So just to summarize, clearly what we saw, and specifically in the case of the CFTA, we saw a lot of hopes that the CFTA will help to address those issues, and specifically when we talk about trading with other countries, we saw that the CFTA may eventually untap investments in some African countries. But clearly there are areas that the countries need to address specifically, that this is something that the countries will have to do. The UK government on this side is a lot of things is already doing, and the summit has been a very good initiative. But I think there are more things that are already the government is already doing to support the transformation of dealing with these issues in the continent. And finally, for the UK, for the investors in the UK, Africa may be like China in 1980. Is that opportunity that you have to be there. Everyone would have liked to be at that place, to be there at the moment when that is booming. So this is basically an opportunity, and for Africa, of course, is the opportunity of attract investment that can boost the economy, transform, and provide jobs for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure now to turn over the mic to Rachel Turner, who's Director of Economic Development at DFID. Really glad to have you with us, Rachel. I know it's been a very, very busy time for you, and we're thrilled that you found time for us. So over to you.
Oh, well, thank you very much, and thank you. I think everybody has said warm words about the fact that we had the summit and about the summit itself. So thank you. And I think Dom and Stephen used the words confidence and opportunity, and absolutely that's what we were trying to engender with the summit. And when Ngozi summed up at the end, she said the overriding theme of the summit had been one of positivity. And we were so keen to create a summit that set out the opportunity that Africa presents and the opportunity for mutual partnerships. And if you haven't had a chance to read the Prime Minister's speech, do read it. And the Prime Minister was absolutely clear that our ambition is to be the investment partner of choice for Africa, and that we are looking to create lasting partnerships for mutual prosperity that will benefit the UK and benefit Africa. And that, I think that tone, that positivity, the use of the word lasting, these are all really important things to clock about what the UK government was trying to achieve with the summit. And there was a real buzz, actually, and and there were, and the room was absolutely packed. It was buzzing, and so we were pleased with the outcome. We didn't just have one day. We've actually had a series of events going right back, actually, before Christmas. We had a pre-event on agri-tech partnerships. We had an event on manufacturing. We had an event on clean energy. We had a fintech event last night. Those of us with the energy left did a fintech event. And actually today is a day on infrastructure financing. So I just wanted to say a few words about two specific things in terms of things we were trying to do and things we're committed to following up. And there was a heck of a lot of other things to say. But first of all, on the manufacturing piece, I mean, Dom has gone. Dom has been a great advisor to me and to the department to really understand the manufacturing opportunities. And the things he said are things that we're listening to. We did announce somewhere around the summit the fact that our Manufacturing Africa program, that many of you know, will be moving into West Africa. So we are absolutely determined to roll out and to support African governments with next steps on their industrial policies, and particularly in the manufacturing space, and to take forward some of the issues that Dom was talking about. The manufacturing side event for the summit, actually, for me, it was, I really enjoyed it. We had UK incumbent firms in the manufacturing sector, but we also had a lot of UK firms who were looking new at Africa. And there was a really serious conversation about opportunity, about how incumbents in the manufacturing sector had overcome constraints. And some of the discussions about skills and skill levels in Africa, this phrase that you just used, Matt, I've not heard that before, the Africa talent was absolutely in the room on the manufacturing sector, with some of the comments about the UK incumbent firms, about the quality of the African labour force were just, for me it was just really exciting, the opportunity there. So I'm absolutely committed to engage with next steps on the manufacturing piece, and lots of excitement in the room. The other thing I wanted to say a little bit about was the investment piece beyond FDI. Of course, FDI is only one piece of investment. And the other piece that we put a lot of work into is the wider capital markets offer. And one of the themes of the summit was the offer from the UK financial sector, and particularly the City of London. And we launched a new partnership with the London Stock Exchange around the summit. And the London Stock Exchange is the exchange of choice for Africa. And actually, I think those statistics are not so well known, Paul, and actually looking at the number of African firms listed on the LSE, looking at the way the London Stock Exchange has been innovating new products to meet the demands of Africa, has been eye-opening and very exciting for us. And we announced 3 new capital market products and partnerships. One of them around really driving forward local currency financing for the continent. We in DFID and across the UK government, we absolutely feel that the next step in investment for Africa has to be investment in the currency of Africa. Too much investment is still in the main currencies, and that is not a sign of mature investment. So we launched a new local currency partnership. We had a Kenya bond, a Kenya shilling bond listed on, I've lost track of where we are today, Tuesday, on Friday. We worked with the Rwandans on a Rwanda franc bond. Extraordinarily exciting, I think, to see a Rwanda franc bond being talked about at the London Stock Exchange. And we agreed a new facility with the World Bank's International Finance Corporation, the IFC, to underwrite corporate bonds in local currency, which is also really important. And, this stuff really matters because it means foreign exchange risk is not passed on to consumers. There were 2 other pieces in the capital market space that I wanted to talk about. We also announced a new development impact bond fund. The UK has had a lot of experience with development impact bonds, and we want to share that with Africa. African countries have been asking us how they can take forward mobilizing impact investors. The UK is home to a growing impact investor community. The UK Impact Investment Institute was launched before Christmas, so we launched a new partnership with African governments on impact investing and development impact bonds. And then finally, we scaled up our offer across Africa on capital market regulation deepening, and particularly the next steps in interoperability of financial systems, to pick up Stephen's points about cross-border finance to back up cross-border trade, but also next steps in fintech and remittances and financial inclusion and financial deepening. And that was one of the biggest announcements in the package of support. And so for me, alongside FDI, and we absolutely recognise the benefits of FDI, the thing we'll also be taking forward is this much wider capital markets investment partnership, which I think really goes to one of the comparative advantages of the UK. And then just, finally, what is this finance for? And the thing that we really tried to focus on during the summit was on infrastructure financing. My Secretary of State launched a commission on infrastructure, the International Development Infrastructure Commission. It reported yesterday. It looked very carefully at how the UK can take forward next steps to support African governments with their infrastructure financing. And we also committed to support Africa with next steps on cities, recognising that it's going to be cities that are going to drive future economic opportunity. And we were very excited to launch a new facility to help African countries access the best expertise we can on the planning, the management and financing of cities. So, Paul, those are just a few words about some of the things we did. It's all out there online. It's all there in press releases, in summit conclusions. But it's great to have this opportunity to talk more about it. And I think, it's always a bit tiring the day after a summit. So to have to talk about next steps is always a bit, can't I have a day off? But this is the right thing to do, to keep the energy going and to keep driving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel, not just for your energy, but for your passion and commitment to Africa. You mentioned the Rwanda franc bond. We're particularly privileged to welcome you, Claire Akamanzi, the CEO of the Rwanda Development Board. Rwanda has been so important. At this summit, the board has been important in facilitating private sector-led development through increased investment and exports in relation to Rwanda. We're glad to have you with us, and we're glad of the contribution of President Kagame. So over to you. You've got 7 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lord Boateng, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased that I made it. I almost didn't make it to this panel. We have a very busy schedule here. We have our president here. I'm part of the delegation. We had a very busy day yesterday at the UK-Africa Summit. But we also had our own Rwanda event today with British investors, UK investors, and several meetings trying to build on the momentum that we're seeing with the UK-Africa Summit. So very pleased to be here, and I'm glad I could make it to the ODI Summit afternoon session as well. So Rwanda, in 2010, we attracted investments worth only about $390 million. Last year, when we closed 2019, we had attracted investments worth $2.4 billion. So we saw a growth from about just below $400 million to $2.4 billion almost 9 years later. And what is it that Rwanda has been doing or putting in place to become attractive for investors? And as you all know, Rwanda, I think when Rachel said it was very exciting to see Rwandan franc on the London Stock Exchange market, you know our history, the very low base that Rwanda was coming from. Nothing working, no infrastructure, no one was thinking about investing in Rwanda before 1994. And so what is it that we've done to try and be competitive for investments in the country so we can reach the $2.4 billion that we've reached today? I'll talk about maybe 5 key actions that the government of Rwanda has been implementing to give ourselves a better bet at getting investors in our country, despite the very strong odds against us and very difficult baseline that we're coming from as a country. I think the first thing that our government decided to do, coming from the genocide in 1994, is what is it that we can do that can make us not lose our country after losing 1 million people? The best thing we can do for our people is give them a future that they want to be part of, that they can be proud of, and that they can be hopeful about. A future that incrementally we see some progress happening. So we came up with a vision. Everyone comes up with a vision. We want to become a middle-income country. But we also made sure that it was very clear what that meant in terms of jobs to be created every year, what that meant in terms of investments to be attracted, exports to be made. We made it very specific. And every year, we signed performance contracts with our president. It's one of the things that I have to make sure that I don't sleep until it's very clear that I'm meeting my target. Otherwise, every once a year, the president will hold a meeting in parliament with all parliamentarians, and each of us has to account for what we did the year before. So making sure that our vision and strategies are actually being implemented very practically, but also being held accountable as leaders if we're not reaching those goals is something that the government made very clear, which has really helped us to see progress every year when we sit down to see how we're doing with our vision. One of the big parts of that vision was how can Rwanda become a hub through which investors can go to the rest of the continent. Many people knew South Africa, they knew Kenya, many countries that actually positioned themselves in many ways as the hubs. But what is it that we're going to do as Rwanda to also make investors not look at our small country, everybody says it's small, 12 million people, but actually look at a gateway that Rwanda could be for the rest of the continent. So we started devising policies, strategies to try and become a country that attracts capital that is going beyond Rwanda to the rest of the continent. The second thing that we did is business environment, very, very important. If we were going to compete with countries that had been established, we were going to have to try and make it as easy as possible to do business in Rwanda. When this vision started 10 years ago, the president called a cabinet meeting and said, you know, Rwanda is ranked 158th in the world. We are the last. We don't want to be among the last. And I remember telling him, no, actually, no, we're not the last. We're 158 out of 165. There's some countries that are behind us. And I remember the president saying, that is the same as the last. Don't even try to distinguish yourself. You are the last, and I don't want us to be the last. Let's aim at doing better. And we started, you know, step by step, every year making progress. So 10 years down the road, Rwanda is ranked the 38th easiest place to do business in the world, and we rank second after Mauritius on the African continent. And that has been a progressive action over the last 10 years, trying to make ourselves different from the rest of the continent so we can have a better chance of getting there. If you want to register business, you can do it here in the City of London. You go online. It's free of charge. It takes 6 hours. We guarantee that you'll get an investment a company registered within 6 hours, and you don't even have to be physically present in Rwanda. We have an automated system online that you can do that. So those are the examples of what we put in place to just make it easy to do business. And of course, we partnered with companies like Trademark, and Frank will be talking about what they did. One border post, making it easy for goods and to move in and out of the country, and really partnering with people that have expertise to help us achieve that goal, I think was very much central to what we did. The third thing was institutions. How do you create institutions that can be the interface with private sector? That is the institution that I lead, the Rwanda Development Board. Our government created a one-stop institution. If you want to register a company, you come to us. If you want to register intellectual property, you come to us. If you want an environmental clearance certificate, you come to us. If you want to negotiate an investment certificate, you come to us. If you want a privatization deal, you come to us. If you want a PPPP, you come to us. So it's one organization with the key functions of supporting investors. So you don't have to go from this ministry to that ministry. You come to us, and if we need the ministries, we'll talk to them and bring them. But we don't let you waste time talking to many ministries. And that's really what our organization was put in place, and very much central in seeing the business climate improvements and also the number of investments grow over time. The fourth one was infrastructure. As I said, we had a vision, a strategy to become a hub. So every infrastructure that we're thinking and prioritizing was very much to respond to that need. And in some of the sectors that we actually picked, we were completely nowhere on the map. I'll give you an example. We decided in becoming an African hub, we decided we were going to try and be competitive in attracting events and conferences into Rwanda, something that is called MICE tourism. And no one knew Rwanda. There's this ranking called the ICCA, International Conference something association. They rank countries using how many conferences they actually attract every year. Rwanda was among the last countries that were ranking in that map. This is just 7 years ago. We said, okay, let's invest in an airline. Very difficult, very expensive. I remember the IMF and World Bank was saying, an airline? You need primary schools. You need vaccination. You need the basic things, which is true. We needed the basics, but we also knew you can't just focus on the basics. It's an ecosystem you're building. As you work on the basics, you're also really improving the other bets in other sectors. So we decided to do a comprehensive investment. So we built an airline, Rwanda Airline. No, hardly was there any, there's only one airline that was flying to Rwanda at the time, which was Brussels Airlines, because of legacy issues with colonialism and all of that. But other than that, there was no airline that was flying to Rwanda. We decided to invest in Rwanda, and today we have about 10 airlines that come to Rwanda just because we took the first step. Our own Rwanda Air flies to about 29 destinations, including London. If you want to come to Rwanda, you can fly Rwanda Air from Gatwick to Rwanda. So investing in that infrastructure, we also put in policies, visas on arrival. Anyone from anywhere in the world who wants to come to Rwanda, you don't have to run around our embassy to get a visa. You get it when you arrive in Rwanda. We made that easy because we're trying to become a conference hub. And then we also invested in the first 5-star hotel. We didn't have any 5-star hotel. Again, I remember the World Bank very much against the idea, saying you don't need a 5-star hotel. You need housing. True, we needed that kind of housing, but we also wanted a hotel. And we like to joke that ever since we finished building the 5-star hotel, if the World Bank people did not get a room in the hotel, we would be in trouble. So it was a good thing for them as well as it was for us. So, and then we built a convention center that accommodates 1,500 people. And in fact, we used we put out a sovereign bond that helped us raise the money for the convention center. Having done all of that, with the strategy of becoming a hub, Today, Rwanda is ranked the second country in attracting the most conferences on the African continent, only after South Africa. So you can imagine coming from, and these are real numbers, real delegates coming to do their conferences in Rwanda. The last one that I want to talk about is also identifying those target sectors, but also putting a team dedicated on behalf of government to take these sectors to fruition. So we have what we call a deal-focused team in an accelerator within the RDB. It's our team that works on that, but we also have ministries that work with our team. But these are the deal-focused people who, they talk deals with investors. When investors come, you can't put, we've learned that you can't just say I have, a tax structure or an investment structure that is one size fits all. We've seen that for some investors, we actually have to be very specific and do structuring with them, identifying the sectors we want, but also really sitting down with them and trying to build something that works, in the country, because it's not always that obvious. One last example that I want to give in line with that is Rwanda decided to become a proof of concept country most recently. We said, look, many innovations are happening out there. People are looking for where to test these innovations. How can we create Rwanda as that laboratory where we'll give you the conditions you can start a business so easily? Rwanda is very safe, among the safest countries in the continent, but also the world. We're ranked 5th safest according to the World Economic Forum in the world. Corruption hardly there, very low levels of corruption. So we've built all of this. But then how do we also build a technology base where people can come and try their technologies or innovations? We did that. We started with a company called Zipline. They do drones. They had developed a prototype in the US, in Silicon Valley. They wanted to use drones to supply blood or medical emergencies. They didn't do that in the US because the US didn't have regulations ready. They came to us. We didn't have regulations either, but we said, let's sit down, let's learn together, let's put regulations, let's try it on our airspace. And today, having been very successful in Rwanda, they've already done so in Ghana. They are supplying blood in Ghana. They're negotiating contracts in Tanzania and Zimbabwe. So that is who we want to be as Rwanda. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Claire. And you've also invested in Arsenal Football Club. And I hope that proves ultimately to be a successful investment as your investment.
Tonight with Chelsea.
We will see tonight. I'm sure it will pay dividends in the end. Thank you for that, and thank you for making time for us. You mentioned Trademark East Africa, and it's a great pleasure to have you with us, Frank. You bring a breadth of experience, and you're from an institution whose origins lie in the Africa Commission. I remember it very, very well. I remember its launch at Cape Town WEF. And you've done great things ever since, and we look forward to hearing more and your predictions for the future.
Thanks very much, Chair. And may I say it's a real pleasure to be here today. Thanks so much to ODI, and well done to the UK government. I thought that was a really positive AIS, and the energy in the room was really quite something. And Claire, I'm glad to tell you as well that I'm an Arsenal supporter. Yeah. But
Sorry.
it does feel a bit like that sometimes, doesn't it? But I mean, I think with I mean, first of all, just to say, I thought the report, the paper that was put together was really interesting, and a lot of quite interesting facts there. Some things that I'll come back to in terms of the standard gauge railway in Kenya, because I think that's an important issue. But I mean, just to say a bit about, one of the things that came across in the report was really the importance of dealing with high trade costs. Okay, and it's something that we focused on now for the last 10 years, and as Claire said, and others, we do a lot of work on trying to reduce the frictions of moving goods across borders, but also port reform, because ports are a big border if you think about it. So there's been a lot of progress made with Rwanda, for example, where the average time to get through a border has fallen by about 70%. And although Mombasa isn't an easy port to get through, there has been improvement over the last 10 years, broadly a 50% decline through the port itself. So these I think, are very credible things that can be done. But I mean, I think really addressing the question, what can be done now to boost investment and trade? And I totally agree with Stephen and I guess, Vera, of what you said about the opportunities with the new trade agreements. And I know this is something Rachel and I have discussed. There's a lot of potential for the UK to make this a very pro-trade deal. Rules of origin issues you mentioned, standards. Really, it's the cost of market entry for a lot of African firms is very high. And I think the UK can really potentially make a really pro-development trade agreements. And I know that this is something, Rachel, you and the teams are looking at, but I think it's important to say, and I think particularly the rules of origin, when we're talking about manufacturing, have potentially a very large impact. So I just sort of park that there, but I think from a policy perspective, I really agree with that a lot. But I also think there's a great opportunity out there, and we talked about it on the panel yesterday at the AIS, was really the Continental Free Trade Area, and you talked about that again, Stephen. And I do think the CFTA, the AFCFTA, offers big opportunities. However, it will take a lot of effort and time to make sure that it happens. And what we want to avoid is a trade agreement that isn't used. So I think, it's really going to be about making it possible to trade by removing trade barriers, which are very substantial. But I really remain very optimistic that there's a huge opportunity. And the market size that's offered, Stephen talked about, so, potentially more than 2 billion people over the next 20 years, growing middle class, and great opportunities. And I think in sectors, and I thought, Max, your paper was interesting, that, really the UK focus has been on extractives and financial services. And I think there's a lot more opportunity for investment in sectors like logistics, low-cost housing, agro, processing. I could go on, but clearly also renewables. And it's important to think about that. So say all of that, but what I wanted to say, I guess, was that it's quite important that we continue the efforts to reduce problems with trade barriers. Okay, and they are still very substantial. I've been lucky, and I thank the UK government for all the support over the years, because it's really allowed this to happen. But trade costs in East Africa have fallen by 40%. But hell, it needs to fall by another 40% to be basically competitive with middle-income countries. So there's still quite a long way to go. The CFTA will provide, I think, a great opportunity, but what do we need to do? We need to still focus on reducing the delays at ports, at choke points, infrastructure. There are still issues, and I don't just mean roads, increasingly railways. And you mentioned the SGR in Kenya. I know Graham Shaw's in the audience. The inefficiency now of the railhead into Nairobi at Embakasi is driving more costs than actually at the port. So these are sort of, the problems do actually change. And we need to think increasingly about the intermodal aspects of the infrastructure, and potentially more of that infrastructure being developed and delivered through PPP arrangements with fiscal space declining. So those choke points need to be looked at, and increasingly, they are holding back trade. The second thing I'd say is that, for example, between Kenya and Ethiopia, the custom systems don't connect. So that means that there's no way of transferring data across. So you have to stop every shipment. And we need to create a digital connections across the continent, really like a digital trade corridor going alongside a physical goods corridor. And I think again, you commented on that, and I think that's something that I think is really going to be important. And one of the things that came up in this report was the problems of corruption and tax, and the issues around that, there's an unlevel playing field. And I personally think increasingly automation of a lot of that is very important. And in Kenya, we're investing in the new custom system that we really will hope will reduce problems in that way, but also increase revenues. The other thing, as I'd say, is we may go a long way to reducing tariffs across Africa, but one of the key problems that we face are non-tariff barriers. It's a bit like that game of Caterpillar. You push them down and they reappear in other ways. NTBs have a pernicious way of reappearing. And I think, actually dealing with having a proper architecture around dealing with them will be really important. And your report talked a lot about red tape. And I think there's a lot of potential to streamline further and put a lot of this on blockchain so that there's also increased transparency and confidence. If you look at certificates of origin, I was talking to the head of customs the other day in I won't mention which country, but in one of my countries that I work in, and the problem with counterfeit certificates of origin is a major problem. And then the delays associated with trying to verify it's like picking up the phone. They have to do that. It's just incredible. You imagine how many shipments have those problems. I think the final thing I'd say really is around industrialization. I mean, I think again the wider CFTA offers opportunities for industrialization. A lot will depend on the way the rules of origin are worked out, and I think again that goes back to the role that the UK can play here. But increasingly, I think as well, what Dominic said is that if you think about an average shirt like the one I'm wearing, it's not a particularly good one, but the cloth comes from China, the buttons come from China, the only value add is the labor, and that needs to really stop. There needs to be much more of a focus in some of the backward linkages. I'm not saying it should stop completely, but there should be efforts to really develop those backward linkages in those, in the local economies. And I mean, certainly the potential for that is quite strong, particularly in the tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers around the garments industry, for example. So, I personally think that's something that should be looked at in terms of some of the industrial policies. And perhaps, maybe just to close, maybe we need to look at the opportunity of the Continental Free Trade Area beyond just nationally based policies to something that's much more regional. And I think one of that requires quite a change in mindset, because a lot of industrial policies are very nationally focused. I'm not saying that's wholly bad, but if we want to develop more regional value chains as a way of enhancing capability, actually it's quite important that people get beyond the national. And UK firms can bring a lot of expertise. There is there's a lot of potential for that partnership with the UK, I think, to leverage in a lot of capability to help some of those supply chains develop further.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Frank. And I think to argue for regional economic integration and getting beyond the national in Africa at this time in this country is quite a brave thing to do. But perhaps we shouldn't go there. But there is a very serious point you make about what is an industrial policy for Africa? What does it look like? How do we ensure that we are able to answer the benefit question? How does this benefit Africa? Well, over to you now to answer that question. We're really short on time, so what we're going to do is we're going to take 3 questions or 3 points, because don't feel you've got to wrap up your point in a question. If you're burning and dying to say something, say it. Don't dress it up as a question. We're going to take them in blocks of 3, and we're going to go on for as long as I'm allowed to go on for, which won't be much more than 15 minutes. So if I can take you, sir, then you, and then you, the gentleman. Yeah, those 3. Starting with you.
Stand up.
Yep.
Sure. I chair the British Chamber of Commerce in Kenya.
Yep.
There we go. Graham Shaw. I chair the British Chamber of Commerce in Kenya, although we're now reaching out to the region, including Rwanda, Uganda, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. Points I want to make, and it may be
a point you want to make.
The point I want to make, we don't talk about judiciary. And I think the judiciary is something that needs to be handled, and it needs to be handled pretty quickly. It will frankly remove corruption, and if I were to tell you, and I'm hoping this is Chatham House rules in this
it's being broadcast across the World Wide Web. It is
excellent.
Not Chatham House rules.
Chatham House rules. All I can say to you is that the number of cases that are open in Kenya today, you'll be shocked, is over 600,000, and that needs to be handled. It needs to be handled quickly. My proposal to the panel is that we try and bring in Commonwealth judges to help with clearing up that backlog, and it will help a lot with policy, with prediction, and with corruption. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Rachel, if I can just give you fair warning on this. This reflects a question that's come in from the World Wide Web from John Gibb, pointing to the corruption that exists in Africa, asking what DFID is going to be doing about that. rather than funding, as he put it, conferences in London, a waste of time and taxpayers' money. That's John Gibbs's view. So just to give you fair warning, I'm going to come to you on that. Then Yuso, happens to have the microphone, and someone there who's going to get it in a minute.
Yes, thank you. Ewan Grant, Grant and Gutzel, Customs and Tax Consultants. My colleague, Mr. Gutzel, is beside me as well. We've both worked in
Don't worry, we
Sub-Saharan
won't hold that
Africa.
against you. What's your point?
Indeed. My question is Chinese investment. To what extent is that providing collateral opportunities for the UK and indeed European countries? To what extent is it inhibiting it? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Is your colleague the gentleman in the blue shirt? Oh, no, good. Then, okay, fine. Then he's not going to get the microphone. The gentleman in the blue shirt, and then the gentleman back there. You've got a microphone already? Over to you, and then the gentleman in the blue shirt. Yeah.
Basically, there is a very straightforward way of increasing for economic growth, and the low-hanging fruits for economic growth, even way before industrialization and manufacturing for exports, is a basic need, which is construction sector, especially for housing, for low-cost housing. Yeah. And I've heard CDC has finally found some good idea of helping with low-cost housing in some country like Malawi. They are trying to expand in Kenya. And I've heard the CDC is also interested to start in Somaliland, in East Africa. So can you confirm that the DFID and the CDC, Commonwealth Development Corporation, will be interested to fund low-cost housing in East Africa and Somaliland especially? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And then the quick question from you, sir, then I'm
Thank you.
going to the panel.
Hewitt from ODI. I'm going to be very daring and mention President Macron at a meeting on UK investment in Africa. But about 2 weeks ago in Ivory Coast, he announced he was going to liberate Francophone West Africa from the CFA franc. Within 3 days, Nigeria had announced it wouldn't join the new currency, the new named currency, the ECHO. So I'm going to ask Stephen, to what extent is common currency alignment within Africa an important part of the integration, the continental free trade integration? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Stephen, why don't we begin with the answer to that question?
So the common aspiration for common currency at the moment is not what Africa is aiming for. What Africa is aiming for now is we want to work on issues of currency convertibility, which is easy to work with. But much more importantly, there is a digital transformation strategy that currently under preparation and consideration by the African leaders. And the aim of that is so that we can be able to work on electronic commerce, whereby you have payment systems that do not actually require you either to have a common currency, but you can actually be able to clear the trade at the end of the day because you have interoperable systems. So that is where Africa sees an opportunity rather than trying to get a common currency for all the 54 countries.
Thank you very much. What's your view about this corruption question and how you're going to spend money on reforming the judiciary and all of that?
Well, I think the UK government's been absolutely clear that we continue to support African governments and civil society, and particularly civil society with their anti-corruption efforts. We announced last year a major scale-up of our effort to combat illicit financial flows. It was something that previous Secretary of State's committed to, and we are continuing to put a lot of effort into tackling illicit financial flows. We've scaled up our work with the Financial Action Task Force, and the announcement that we made at the summit about our work on financial sector regulation, a large part of that, and that's an offer that we're making across numerous countries in Africa to particularly work with the banking system, to take the banking system to the next level of robustness to meet the FATF standards that are these standards for managing anti-money laundering.
Thank you very much. You want to come in on that?
Yeah, no, just to say, I mean, I think I agree with Graham, you know, that there is some support to judiciary required, and particularly arbitration. Because let's face it, a lot of things go to court. Even I know if you're caught for speeding in Kenya, you go to court. I mean, the courts are looking at an unnecessarily long list of things, some of which are very inconsequential. So I think an arbitration to weed out and actually look at the hardcore cases, Graham, is probably needed. And I think you make a good point that needs to be taken forward. And I think on the corruption issue, I just wanted to really reiterate, like, for example, the customs management system that we're doing in Kenya, the pilots have increased revenue by 25%. What does that mean? That means that's not being leaked. So actually, I think the potential for technology to take some of the discretion out of the equation is actually very strong.
Thank you.
That's an important point.
The question's been raised about China. Claire, Rwanda has been in the forefront not just of engaging in terms of investment with the West, it's also been very forthright in engaging with the East. Can you give us your view about the potential for China-UK cooperation, East-West cooperation on these issues?
Thank you. On the question of China, what our view as Rwanda is, it's not an either or. It's not either UK or China or US or whatever. And we don't think the UK investors should be making decisions to invest because of China, whether it's good or bad for them. For us, our stand is there's enough space for China, there's enough space for UK, there's enough space for US, Russia. So your ability to give us a good deal is what matters the most. So come to us with a deal. Come to us if the best deal comes from China, we'll take it. If the best deal comes from the UK, we'll take it. So come and negotiate and bring the merit of that deal that you're bringing, and that's what matters. Not comparing with China, comparing with other. And I think the space is there for all that want to invest.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, I'd like to give a comment also on the question of corruption. I think it's actually not very fair to ask DFID what they're doing about fighting corruption on the African continent. I think you should be asking the leaders of the African continent. What we've seen in Rwanda is that fighting corruption is very much a political will issue. All countries have the right institutions and the right laws. They will tell you about the Auditor General's office, they'll tell you about the Ombudsman office, they'll tell you about the courts, the laws that fight corruption. But I think the most important component of all of that is their political will to enforce these rules and to make sure institutions do what they're supposed to be doing. That, for us, everybody asks us, how was Rwanda able to fight corruption? Of course, we still have corruption in Rwanda, but it's at very low scale. And the reason for that is just enforcing, making sure whether it's a mayor of a village or a minister or a prime minister, if there is an issue of corruption, they will be held accountable. And I think that has been very, very helpful. My last comment on the judiciary. One thing that has helped us in Rwanda, we had a backlog of cases, just like the case you shared. One thing that really helped us, one of the biggest reasons that our backlog would have lasted for another 100 years would be the genocide cases, because there were 2 million cases to be tried. We had to come up with an innovative gacaca system where we didn't use the conventional judicial system that takes a lot of procedures, a lot of court, filing time, and all those things that take a lot of time. We made it a very simple. We used eminent leaders of societies to sit, and those cases were completed. All the cases of genocide have been completed. For today, all judges are given targets of a minimum number of cases they must hear, so they don't waste time. So every judge knows that by the end of the year, I'm going to be held accountable how many cases I had. If you don't give them those targets, they can listen to 2-3 cases the whole year, and it's okay. And we didn't let that happen.
Thank you. The question was raised about investment in housing. Now, DFID, to my certain knowledge, is investing in water and sanitation, with a particular reference to the urban poor. But did your research produce any insights into how decisions are being made by British companies, as the extent to which they want to get involved in that sort of investment, design, architecture, large housing projects?
Well, no, among the firms that we survey, actually, we didn't find a lot of interest specifically on that sector. And we were quite focused in some cases in the sectors. Definitely we left out the extractive sector in the assessment, but also we were looking, because we think that is important in terms of economic transformation, is in those sectors that can help to create global competitiveness of Africa. And clearly we focus mostly on agribusiness, of course, on manufacturing, but also on the services sector.
Thank you very much. Now, have I got another 10 minutes or not? I've only got 5 minutes on my clock. Have I got another 10? Yes, I have. Okay, good. Sir.
Hi, so my name is David Kendall. I work in the tech sector, so I advise tech companies to build businesses in emerging markets. In Africa, the largest employers are the, obviously, enterprise, the young people creating jobs. To what extent is the UK government investing in the burgeoning tech sector to make sure that there's a good flow of capital and also growth in enterprise and employment?
Thank you, sir. And I'm going all the way back. This is the last round of questions. The panel will answer them as they see fit in their final remarks. Yep.
Emmanuel Alana, Town Planning and Economic Development Consultant. I'm going to touch on 2 points.
No, you're not. 1 point.
Okay, just 1 point. The issue, I hope this opportunity will not create corruption smoke screen in Africa, because investment attracts corruption. Because
so what's your point?
My point here is, provided the financial institutions here will help us to stop those measures, because if people over here have the same correspondence of mind with those who are bringing those money here, this will create a smoke screen. My second point.
No, I'm sorry, sir.
Second point is
we can't have it. We've got to be disciplined. Thank you very much. Good point, sir.
Okay, my question is to Frank. My name is Dr. Msewole Selassie. I'm a SME fintech. We did a lot of business in East Africa in the previous, but what's your major investment for financial support for fintech? Because we struggle from the bank of our banks from UK because the risk is high. How do you cover that?
Yeah.
What is your challenge?
De-risking bank loans, patient capital. We know about that, don't we? Yep, gentleman at the back.
Hello, my name is Isaac Ruchagwenda. I'm from Rwanda, doing my master's in public policy here. My question, obviously, is to Claire. Would you say Rwanda is ready to give the same kind of incentives in the creative industry than it's been giving, like in manufacturing, for example? A case in example, it would be Ghana. Last year, they declared 2019 to be their year of return, and they had a lot of activities throughout the year, culminating in a 3-day music festival. And it's said that the year of return brought in $1.9 billion in investments. So is this a sector that Rwanda is looking to exploit as well, the creative industry?
Thank you very much. Yes?
Co-president of Sudan British Business Council. Sir. And the 2 really quick points. They're all intermingled points. And one is that the UK needs to take the moral ground in Africa again, because it has stepped back in terms of its foreign policy and allowed others to step in. The second thing is...
No, sorry, sir. Thank you very much. Right, sir. Yes, you at the back.
I'll keep it very brief. Clearly, the focus has been investment, opportunity and growth throughout AIS and this meeting today, which makes perfect sense. But have there been parallel discussions with regards to setting the standards for environmental social governance alongside the investments that are being made within Africa, which will drive the standards and hopefully the sustainability of these businesses?
Thank you. Gentleman there and lady there.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm from Senegal, living in Brussels, working for Gopa Group Consultants. Quick question. What is the strategy for Francophone countries in Africa? Is language a problem for investing in other countries?
Thanks. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Okay, I'm wondering about the impact of the free trade agreement on the tax revenues for the governments, because currently some countries take like about 20% or even more tax revenues because of the trade tariffs. So I wonder how we gonna replace this gap.
Internal revenue generation, are we going to be having more personal taxation rather than indirect taxation? What's the balance? Thank you very much. Is anyone dying to ask one? No? Okay, over to the panel. Beginning with you. No, actually no, because the last word should come from Africa. Beginning with you.
Okay. Right. On fintech, we don't actually work on fintech, but I think Rachel can talk to that a wee bit. But we do work with SMEs, okay? And we're trying to, some of the stuff I talked about, trying to make sure that they're more embedded in some of the export value chains is the kind of work that we do. Sorry. Yeah, the issue of standards for environmental and social standards, something that I think is really, really important, and something that we're definitely doing a lot with firms on, and we have quite a high standard of this in the infrastructure that we deliver ourselves. So I think this is something that is being looked at, and the UK has a good offer there, something that actually partnering with African firms can bring in a lot of expertise into the bargain, I think. In terms of the tech sector, you were talking about young people. One thing we think there's a massive potential for is e-commerce. And in a lot of countries, the regulatory frameworks don't exist. And certainly it's very hard to get anything delivered, let's face it, right? So one of the things we are doing is pushing forward with the regulatory context or the regulations to enable the industry really to move forward. Some countries it exists, like Kenya and Rwanda, but then the delivery is quite a problem. So we want to actually do innovative things like work with the buses to get things delivered, the post offices, obviously. So that's something that we're doing, and a lot of that is involving a lot of young people. So the tech sector, I think personally, has a lot of potential, but it's some of those things that are missing. And the impact on revenues, I mean, maybe Stephen will want to say more about this, but I mean, certainly when countries lose in terms of the tariffs, they can convert some of those revenues into other forms of taxation. And I'm sure he'll say more about that. But not in terms of personal or income tax, it's more in terms of ad valorem, for example.
But what about personal income tax? When you have a situation in which they did a survey, didn't they, of one, I think it was Uganda, they looked at the civil servants and they found that 5% of the civil servants were actually paying any sort of tax at all, personal income tax. Have you got a position on that?
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. I personally think we need to rely on trade taxes less.
Yeah.
Domestic resource mobilization is what it's about, and Rwanda's actually done very well, for example.
Dirk, you had a point you wanted to make?
I had my hand up earlier on. I just wanted to point to the scale of the opportunities that are there. Over the last decade, Africa's GDP increased by 35%, despite a crisis happening. But UK trade, the level was exactly the same in 2018 as it was in 2008. The same as the UK FDI. Stock of FDI was the same in 2017 as it was a decade before. I'm sure that Africa's GDP, both North and Sub-Saharan Africa combined, will increase again by much more than 30 or 50% or so. So the words of Unilever's CEO last week was, you can't afford not to be in Africa. And I think so this summit that we've now had has increased the positivity around Africa and African countries individually. What more can be done? What more needs to be done? Will investment be increasing by itself? So the private sector will take these opportunities, or is more needed? So what is the plan for 5 years, hence 10 years, to be thinking about it?
Good. What is the plan for the next 5 years?
So many questions. So listen, what is the plan? Investment promotion agencies. We had the investment promotion agencies from the countries who were at the summit who came. They had a whole day with us. They had another day presenting. They were there in the summit. And I think the question is, what is the plan for the investment promotion agencies in Africa? And actually this study, which was partly a partnership with the UK Department for International Trade, the Department for International Trade is the UK's inward investment promotion agency, and I think that growing partnership is really, really important. So, and I think the answer to your question has to be, what is the support to the governments to attract inward investment? And there's, and that's there. It's growing. We've got growing partnerships with IPAs. We've had a great week with them all, and we can talk more about that. On standards, the answer is Absolutely, yes. That would take, another session. But there's a huge program of work on investment standards and a huge appetite for a partnership between the work in the UK on impact investing, on taking standards beyond due diligence compliance, beyond the so-called ESG due diligence standards to the next level of impact measurement, an impact measurement towards the global goals. The UN Global Compact had an event in the run-up to the summit where, with our support, they announced a new series of offices that they are going to be opening in Africa to build the impact architecture in the ecosystem. So lots and lots of work on impact, and that's a great conversation, and we could keep having it. On tech, on fintech, the Catalyst project, which is the big partnership we have between the regulators and also supporting matchmaking between UK fintech and Africa fintech. We actually announced yesterday an increase to that partnership. Since 2018, we've had a partnership between the Financial Conduct Authority and the regulators in Africa. Lots going on in that space, and similarly in the digital space, the Digital Access Programme that the UK runs that supports access for excluded groups from digital systems, but also a partnership on cybersecurity with African partners. We also announced the scale up of that around the conference. So lots going on in that space, and absolutely firmly committed to making a success of that.
Thank you very much indeed. Max,
Yes.
you've done all this work.
Yes,
What's
and-
your response to all you've heard?
Well, I would like to be specific on the Francophone point. Clearly, there are opportunities. Of course, British firms find more easy and comfortable to be in countries with similar legal systems, same language, etc. However, we have cases of some British firms that have invested. There is one specifically in Benin because of specific issues that they found in one Anglophone country. So basically, you have examples of British firms actually investing in Francophone countries.
Although, interestingly enough, Benin wasn't invited to the conference.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Right.
But a lot of Francophones were,
Oh,
and
indeed
there was
so.
huge interest in that.
It is, I just mentioned Benin because I had a frantic text from Benin saying, why weren't we invited to the conference? But there have to be choices, there have to be priorities. But it's interesting to observe that someone did actually chose to go to a Francophone country. Claire, the last word must be Africa's.
Thank you. Isaac, what are we doing for the creative industry? This is a very important sector for us now. And the key reforms we've put in place is intellectual property rights. We've put in place new copyrights, patent laws, and we're enforcing them. 3 years ago, if a musician had their song played by a radio station, there'd be nothing that would happen to them. They'd just play it and without permission. Today, that's not possible. We've trained law enforcement. We've also put in place a collective scheme to collect money from radio stations or whoever is using music unauthorized. They're fined. And now that culture is actually improving. We did the first payouts from this collective scheme to musicians last year in 2019. So it's something that is really there to protect creative industry, because if they make money out of it, people respect their rights, then they'll be encouraged to innovate and to create more pieces. We've also put in place a Rwanda Convention Bureau. Their job, this is an institution with about 30 staff. Their job is to just go to the world and market Rwanda for events, including concerts, meetings, and any other types of events to bring in the country. This is a full-time job for these people. We've also established a film commission within the Rwanda Development Board, and the idea is to also develop the film industry in Rwanda, again, building from scratch. We hope that it can be as successful as the conference sector, but this is really what we're trying to put in place to support that sector. Sustainability and environment, very important. We have a whole plan on environment, protecting the environment. I think Rwanda was probably among the first countries to eliminate plastic bags, for example. Mm-hmm. It's been 10 years where you see no plastic in Rwanda. But again, translating that into practices as for business is something we continuously promote, and it's really important. I must agree with you. On the question about customs, taxes, and are we losing that if we go to the CFTA, we've done a lot of simulations, a lot of work, and maybe Stephen has the numbers, but as Rwanda, we did ask ourselves that question, and we also saw the benefits that a more open Africa would bring to our country, the opportunities for jobs, opportunities for entrepreneurship, value chain growth. And when we looked at all that, it was a lot more important to us than just the customs money that we get. And if these businesses grow, they actually pay more money in VAT, consumption taxes, and other taxes that are a lot more important than customs. Last point, we're hosting CHOGM. There's a Commonwealth Business Forum, end of June. Very welcome. Tell your businesses to come for the Commonwealth Business Forum. And to maybe add a last thing, our president announced this morning that we're going to open up a requirement for visas, even those on arrival, no payment, no visas required, for anyone from the Commonwealth and also from the Francophonie organization. So come to Rwanda.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Claire. We couldn't end on a better note. You were asked about cultural industries, Africa's cultural industries. You are, in fact, a living marketing example of Ghanaian textile design in your Kenti jacket. So we celebrate that. But just to end on one important note, we were asked the question, and it's an important question: what benefits Africa? It's a very important question. And in our Akan culture, the culture in which I was brought up in the eastern region of Ghana, the cultural symbol extends right the way across Ivory Coast, Ghana, Lomé. We have something called the Adinkra symbol. You can Google it, Adinkra, A-D-I-N-K-R-A. And there is one particular symbol of the crocodile with one stomach and two heads. And a number of you will know that symbol, and we call it the Funtun Fenefu. And the purpose of that symbol is to demonstrate that the crocodile has two heads and one stomach. Therefore, actually, the heads don't need to fight, because both can chop, both can eat, as we say in West Africa, and yet the one will still benefit. And I think the message from the investment conference was what benefits Africa can also benefit Britain. What benefits Britain can also benefit Africa. And we help with events like this, with your participation, to find the sweet spot that enables that to happen. Thank you all very much for coming.